Today we're going to be learning Yoma Daf Mem Aleph. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to start near the top. We already finished. Okay, we finished this section about the two different Lashonot, the two different versions of Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan about whether or not the goral is ma'akeh. Is it a necessary part of the process, or can we do without it? We ended with a tiyuvta on one of the readings. We're not going to go back there right now, but we're going to start from the words Amar Rav Chisda. So we're now going to bring some halacha that Rav Chisda says, and then the last source that we brought, the last Braita, is going to raise a question on what Rav Chisda says. So we're going to raise a question based on the Braita. Amar Rav Chisda said, Amar Rav Chisda, Ein hakinim mitparshot ela o b'lekichat ba'alim o ba'asiyat kohen. We're now on a different topic. This is a whole bunch of cases, a zav, a zava, a bunch of other situations. Sometimes when somebody's poor and they can't afford a more expensive sacrifice, they bring a pair of birds. So that's called a kinim. One of the kinim is a nest. It means two birds. One is a chatat and one is an olah. Now, you buy a pair of birds and then you designate this one's for the olah, this one's for the chatat. The question is, at what point is your designation set? Meaning, if you designate it this way, it has to be done that way. If the Kohen tries to switch it later, can't be switched. So, there's two stages at which they can be designated. Either the owners designate it when they purchase the birds, or ba'asiyat kohen, or when the Kohen goes to do the sacrifices. Either that or that. Meaning, if it were to be done at a different time, and the owner were to say, after he bought them already, and let's say a few minutes later, he decides, okay, this one's the chatat, this one's the olah. If the Kohen switches them, he can, because the only point at which he can designate it is either when he buys them or when the Kohen does the sacrifice, the Kohen can designate them. Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, my time at Rav Chisda. Where does Rav Chisda get this from? Dichtiv v'lekacha ve'asa. Okay, you have to read the psukim. This is in Vayikra Perek Yubet, verse number 8, so chapter 12. Im lo timtza yada de se, if she can't afford a se, ulekacha shnei torim or shnei b'nei yona, she could take two birds, either torim or yonim, echad le'olah ve'echad le'chatat, v'chiper alea kohen v'tahara. So it says v'lakcha, and then it says v'asa kohen et ha'achad chatat ve'et ha'achad olah. And the Kohen makes one chatat and one olah, and then he purifies her. Now, this seems to indicate the two verbs here were either she purchases it or he does it. Does it means he brings the sacrifice. So that's where he gets it from. So, either or. Now we're going to bring this Braita that we saw in yesterday's daf as a question. Va'asau chatat. Okay, now when it talks about the seir, it says, right, the goat we're discussing, and he makes it chatat. What did they say here? Hagoral oseh chatat, right? Ve'en Hashem oseh chatat. Okay, so here's the pasuk: V'ikriv Aharon et haseir asher ala alav hagoral Hashem. And then the Aharon takes the seir, the goat that had the goral that was determined by the lots to be for God, v'asau chatat, and he makes it into a korban chatat. So now what do they learn from Asau Chatat? That the goral makes it a chatat, ve'en Hashem oseh chatat. Doesn't become a chatat based on me determining this is going to be the chatat and that's going to be the seir, just like the birds, where I determine this or that. No, it doesn't work that way. Now they say, right, only the goral. That's what Asau Chatat comes to teach you. Now, why do you need a pasuk to teach you that? Isn't it obvious the goral is what determines? So they say, this is the Braita we saw yesterday. You might have thought this is a simple kavachomer. In a place where the goral doesn't determine, meaning if you wanted to do a goral on the birds, you couldn't. There's no such thing. It would be ineffective. You could theoretically, but if the Kohen wanted to change it and switch the birds, he could because it was ineffective. Therefore, and yet, in that case, when a goral doesn't work, but yet Kidesh Hashem, but you can do it by just calling it. So makom shekidesh hagoral eino din shekadesh Hashem. So in a case where goral is effective, wouldn't we assume that also calling it by name would be effective? We're going to assume that since a goral doesn't work for the birds, that means it's more limited in what it can do because a goral doesn't work. So therefore also here, since this has more wider capabilities, even a goral works, therefore we're going to say even kriyat shem would work. Talmud Lomar, that's what we need the pasuk to tell you, v'asau chatat, a goral oseh chatat, ve'en Hashem oseh chatat. Now, what's the problem? What does this have to do with Rav Chisda? We're going to see right now. Now, when is the goral done? It's not the time when you purchase the animals. That was done before. And it's not the time when you're sacrificing animals. That happens at a later stage. So if it's not lekicha and it's not a siyah, then how could you even make this comparison that we made right now to the birds, which are, there's no kriyat shem at this stage, as if you would compare this and do it at the same stage, where it's in between the time it was purchased and the time the Kohen does the sacrifice, kriyat shem wouldn't be effective either. So therefore, it sounds like, right, the katani de kavat, sounds like this would work in the exact parallel case by the birds. And Rav Chisda says it doesn't. So the Braita seems to go against Rav Chisda. So Amar Rava hachikama. Rava says, no, read it like this. Ma b'makom shelo kidesh hagoral va'afilu b'shat lekicha va'afilu b'shat asiyah kidesh Hashem b'shat lekicha u'b'shat asiyah. When we hone in on the birds, we're going to say like this. With the birds, a goral wouldn't work, not even b'shat asiyah and b'shat lekicha. Even at those moments where kriyat shem does work, a goral wouldn't work. And therefore, let's take it now to our case, even though we're not dealing with the same moment in time. So wouldn't you think that calling it by name would work at the time you purchased it and at the time that you did the sacrifice? Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. So let's go back for a minute. So Rava says like this. In a case where lo kidesh hagoral, even b'shat lekicha, even b'shat asiyah, and yet calling it by name would work if you did it at the exact right time, either when you purchase it or when the Kohen does the sacrifice. Makom shekidesh hagoral shelo b'shat lekicha, below b'shat asiyah, when the goral is effective, even when it's not one of those opportune times, obviously then, eino din shekadesh Hashem b'shat lekicha b'shat asiyah, shouldn't you think then that calling it by name, at least in the same way, calling it by name will work by the bird sacrifices, eino din shekadesh, right? So shouldn't it work to call the seir by name when, now not right now at this point in the ceremony, but at least either when you purchase it or when the Kohen goes to do the korban. Therefore, Talmud Lomar v'asau chatat, no, asau chatat comes to tell us the only way it can become a chatat is hagoral oseh chatat ve'en Hashem oseh chatat. Only goral works and not the shem, and with that we resolve the issue. Now we're going to have another question on Rav Chisda, Tashma. Mitamei mikdash ani. One of the other cases where you bring a pair of birds is if you have to bring what's called a korban olev yoreh. And one of the cases where you'd have to bring it is if you go into the mikdash and you're tamei by accident. So you bring a korban chatat. And normally you bring an animal for a chatat. But if you don't have the money to afford an animal, that's why it's called olev yoreh. You can bring different types. If you're less rich, you can bring birds, a pair of birds. If you don't even have that amount of money, you can bring a meal offering. We're going to focus right now on someone who becomes poor to the extent that they can afford birds, but they can't afford the animal. So he's a mitamei mikdash who's poor. V'ifrish ma'ot lekina. He separates the money for his bird, his pair of birds. Ve'ashir, but before he brings the sacrifice, he becomes rich, wins the lottery, something happens, gets some inheritance money, he becomes wealthy, has good business deal. V'achar kachama, and then he says, after he already became wealthy, he then says, Elu lachatato ve'elu la'olato. He says, listen, I put this money aside before for the birds. This one's going for my chatat, right? He splits the money in half that he had already designated, and he puts half for the chatat and half for the olah. Now, at this point, though, what happens? But he finds out that he has to actually bring an animal offering. And the animal offering, by the way, is only a chatat. It's not an olah. When you go down a level to the birds, you end up bringing a chatat and an olah, a burnt offering and a sin offering. If it was an animal, it's just a sin offering. So what do? Mosifu mevi chovato midmei chatato. So you add money to what you had set aside for the bird, for the chatat, the sin offering, and you add to that and purchase with that money the animal offering. Ve'em mosifu mevi chovato midmei olato. but you can't add money to the Ola. That you have to just bring as a voluntary Ola offering, because you already designated that money for a Korban Ola. Now, notice something interesting here against Rav Chisda. The moment when he designated which money was for which wasn't at the moment he was purchasing it. And it wasn't at the moment he was doing the sacrifice, for sure not. It was before he even purchased the birds. And yet it's designated and it's effective. If it weren't effective, we'd be able to move the money right back to the chatat, put all the money together and add whatever money you need now to get to an animal and be done with it. So Amar Rav Sheshet, in order to answer the question against Rav Chisda, he says, "V'tizbra, do you really think that that's the case? This braita is obviously a mistake, and I'll tell you why, and then we'll fix the braita, because Ha'amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya, Mitamei mikdash Shiur. What if we have the reverse case? Okay, someone is wealthy, ve'evi korban ani, and instead of bringing the wealthy offering the animal, he decides to bring a poor person's animal. Now, at this point, it sounds like he's wealthy, and he brings the bird offering. But then we're going to see, I said animal before, I meant bird. But we're going to see here, something isn't right here, and it's clearly not the case. What really is that he's wealthy, and then he becomes poor. But now what happens here? He brings a korban ani, lo yatsa. V'kevan de lo yatsa, hechi kava. So what happens? If he brings a poor person's offering, even though he was wealthy, okay, we'll get to exactly what the case is in a minute. It doesn't work. Now, why is it ineffective? Sorry, it must be, I made a mistake. He's wealthy and he brings the korban of a poor person. We'll get to exactly what he was to begin with, etc. That we'll get to in a minute. But now it says, Kevan de lo yatsa hechi kava. Now, he doesn't fulfill his obligation, but they're going to assume the fact that he doesn't fulfill his obligation, they assume, though, that what happened, what he did was something. Okay, what he did, this case, he's rich and he brings a poor person's sacrifice. In the braita, what do we have? He's wealthy, right? He was poor, separated his korban, but notice what happened. He separated money. Then he became wealthy. And after he became wealthy, he then went and designated his money for the poor person's offering. So that's what the Gemara is asking here. So let's look again inside. They say, lost my place. 1 second. Mitamei mikdash ani, right? And then frishmo l'kino v'he. Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Okay. So now, kevan de lo yatsa hechi kava. In the braita that we saw before, he was rich and he brings a poor person's offering. Now, that's what happened again. Look at the order very carefully. First, he was wealthy. He separated money. First he was poor, separated the money for the birds. Then he became rich. Then he designated the birds. Now at that point, he can't fulfill his obligation. If he can't fulfill his obligation, because we just saw that here, that you can't fulfill your obligation. If you're poor, you can't fulfill your obligation with a poor. If you're rich, you can't fulfill it with a poor person's offering. So if that's the case, then how in the braita was he able to determine which one goes where? In which case, there must be something wrong with this braita. So Rav Sheshet says, and that's going to resolve our question against Rav Chisda. Elamai lach lamema. What can you say? Shekvar amal me'aniyuto. He must have said it when he was still poor. Hachanami shekvar amar mishat hafrasha. So therefore, in other words, what's happening? It must be that in the braita, the case must be that he said it at the time that he designated the money. And the time of designating the money is like the time of purchasing the animals. That's what we're going to assume. And once we say it like that, it's like shat lekicha. Okay. And then we have our answer to Rav Chisda. The reason why that designation worked was because it was actually done at the proper time. But again, to do that, you have to change the braita. Ulu Rabbi Chaga, Amar Rabbi Yoshaya, de Amar Yatsa. Now, Rabbi Chaga, in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya, thinks that a rich person who brings a poor person's offering actually fulfills this obligation. In which case, you don't have enough reason to change the wording of the braita to fix Rav Chisda. So therefore, we're back to our question of Rav Chisda. When we had some other problem with the braita, we were able to change the wording. But if the braita seems to stand as is, and it's fine, and it could be that even once he was rich, he designated, this is for my chatat, this is for my hasham, and it worked, this is for my ola, and it works because Why wouldn't it work? Because b'diavad, he could fulfill his obligation by bringing the poor person's offering. So then, ma'ika lamemar, what are we going to say to explain that braita? So they say, lo tema va'achar kachamal. We're going to change something else in the braita. Okay, again, what happened? He was mitame mikdash, he was poor. Then he separated money. He frish ma'od lekino. Then ha'eshil. Then it says, va'achar kachamal, and then he said, elu lachatati ve'elu lo lati. So now instead of saying it like that, we're going to say, and this is just a much more minor, right? Instead of changing the order of events, which is what we had to do for the previous, now we're going to have a different answer. We can say, he then purchased birds. Now at the purchasing, he said, this is for my chatat, this is for my olah. And now, va'amar, lakach, then what happens? So it goes like this. Once he purchased it, mosifu maybe chatato. So now they say, wait a minute. If he purchased it already, then what does it mean? Mosifu maybe chatato, my niu. Deparikle v'ha'em pidyon la'of. But that doesn't make any sense to say that, because what happened in the Braita? He designated the money, and then he said, then he became wealthy. Then he said, this is for my olah, this is for my chatat. And then what's the law? He has to add more money, and with that money for the chatat, purchase the animal, and not with the olah. But if he already bought the animal, if he already bought the bird, then what would he have to do? He'd have to redeem the bird and buy a new one. But he can't redeem a bird because there's no redemption by birds. We've learned this before. Only animals can be redeemed. Birds can't be redeemed. So that's what it says here. If he was lakach, then mosifo mevi chatato ma'niu. How can he add to it and bring a chatat? Because he already bought a bird. And there's nothing, you can't exchange the bird, aim deparikle, right? If you want to say he redeemed it, well, ha aim pidyon la'of. There is no such thing. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense. So Amarav Papa, he's going to explain it differently. Kigon shalakach preda achat. He bought one bird. And then what happened? He designated that bird. Now, once you designate that bird, whatever bird he purchases after is going to be automatically, or whatever money's left is going to automatically be for the other. So now we're going to go through two possibilities. So if the one he purchased, he said, so then he purchases one bird, calls it an ola. If that's the case, then he adds money to whatever money's left. With that, he buys the animal for the chatat. And again, the ola has to be brought as a voluntary burnt offering because he already designated. The high ola, that's what we're going to say right now. It goes as a voluntary offering. What if he purchased the chatat already and you can't, but now we're stuck because you can't redeem it. You can't bring it as a chatat because you actually need to bring an animal. So what do? We'll see in a second. Now, first of all, you can't use the rest of the money for the purchase of the animal because it's an ola. So you're stuck and you have to buy a voluntary burnt offering with that. The high chatat az lamita, and this is a classic example of a chatat that you have nothing to do with and you have to leave the bird to die. That we've seen a number of cases of that in the daf in the past. Gufa. Now we're going to go more in depth into something we said before. Amar Rabbi Elazar, we're totally off topic now. If we weren't before, right? We really got off topic because we started with Rav Chisda. We brought what Rav Chisda said. We said, doesn't the Braita contradict Rav Chisda about when it's designated, either when you purchase the animals or when the Kohen does the korban? We brought the Braita that we had previously discussed in the last sugya to contradict. We resolve it, but then we bring up other questions on Rav Chisda, and with that, try to work it through and try to work out other questions on Rav Chisda based on different opinions. Now we're going to go in depth into this comment that we said, Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Yashara. Mitame mikdash ashir vehivi korban ani. If you're wealthy and you bring a korban ani, lo yatsa. Okay, he says you're not yotze. Rabbi Chaga amar Rabbi Yashaya yatsa. This was the machloket we saw before. Can a rich person be yotze? Can he fulfill his obligation if he brings a poor person's offering? Meitive. So now we bring a contradiction. Mitzora ani. Now we're talking about korban olev yored, someone who goes into the mikdash by accident, not forgetting that they were tamei or not knowing they were tamei, impure. They have to bring this korban. We're now going to compare it to another case where there's a sliding scale of offerings. One of those examples is a mitzora, a leper. Mitzora ani, again, they have the option. They can bring an animal offering or they can bring a bird offering. Mitzora ani shevi korban ashir yatsa. Okay, they actually have to bring 3 sacrifices. Some of them can be substituted with birds. A mitzora ani that brought a korban ashir yatsa. So if you're poor and you bring the rich person's offering, you can fulfill your obligation. But ashir shevi korban ani lo yatsa. But if you're wealthy and you bring a poor person's offering, you can't fulfill your obligation. So here you see ashir shevi korban ani lo yatsa. So how did Rabbi Chaga say that you can be yotze in a korban olevi yored? So they're going to distinguish between the leper case and the korban olevi yored, the sliding scale offering. Shane hatam dichtiv zot. In the mitzora, it specifically said zot. That means zot Torah mitzora. That means it has to be done in this way. If you're poor, you bring it this way. If you're rich, you bring it this way. There's no, I can switch around if I want. But it doesn't say the same thing in the section of the sliding scale offering. So then they say, wait a minute. If it says zot and it has to be done just so, then why did you start off by saying mitzora ani, who brings a rich person's offering, fulfills this obligation, right? Ha Rabbi Rachmana Torat. They say, zot Torat. Torat seems to imply, and we've seen this in a number of cases, Torah means this is the same law across the board. So that means an Aniyah and Ashir could bring the same thing as long as they bring the rich person's offering, right? It goes up, it doesn't go down. If you're rich, you can't bring something lower than you. But if you're poor, you can bring something that's more expensive than you can really afford, which is an interesting question in general. Is that okay, right? On the one hand, you think, of course, if someone wants to spend more money, let them do it. On the other hand, you might think that the Torah will want to protect people so that they don't overspend their money on sacrifices. You know, some people take these things too seriously and end up impoverished. So it's an interesting question, but they seem to think that it's okay. Tanya, but wait, and here's there's a Braita to prove this. Tanya here is a proof. Torat lerabot mitzora ani shevi korban ashir. Okay, and the Braita says here, Torat comes to say the ani can bring just the rich person's offering. Yachal afilu ashir shevi korban ani. You might have thought it also works the reverse. The wealthy person can get away with a poor person's offering, even right, not ideally, but if they did it, they're okay. Talmud lomar zot. It doesn't work. So now they say, so there's a unique halacha by the mitzora because of the words. So now they say, well, why don't you learn from one to the other, right? Because both are similar. There's poor person's offering, there's rich person's offering. Why don't you just say, once we have that drasha, neilaf mina, why don't we learn from there to the other case? So they say, miet rachmana v'im dalhu. It says by the mitzora, im dalhu, if he is poor, which means this law only applies to him and not to anyone else in a similar situation, meaning not to someone who needs to bring a sliding scale offering. Okay. New Mishnah. So again, that was all a tangent we got off of because of that Braita that we used as a question on Rav Chisda. Back to our topic. Continuing on with what the Kohen Gadol does. So he's got the Seirim, he does the Goral on the goats, he casts lots, he places it on the animal. Now what does he do once he has the 2 animals? If you remember, they're both facing west, inward. He now ties a red piece of wool around the head of the Seir Mishtalech. There's a picture of this in the link in the pictures that you can find on our site. And then he stands it up next to where he's going to be sent out to, meaning we now turn him around and he faces east out of the temple. Okay, so he basically looks east away from the temple to basically say, okay, I'm going, right? That's where he's heading, out of the temple. And the one who's going to be slaughtered goes, now here, I shouldn't even say what this means. We don't really know what this means. Something is done keneged beit shchitato instead of, right? There it said, there's 2 verbs that happen. We put the wool on him and then we turn him around. So the question is, what is done keneged beit shchitato? Beit shchitato is usually could be his neck, and then it means we tie something around his neck. Whereas the first one, if you notice, they did it birosh on the head. They tied this red wool. Now they say the nishchat, maybe we tie it around his neck, and that will distinguish the 2 of them. Or possibly it means he stood up facing where he's going to be slaughtered, which is again facing westward into the Beit HaMikdash, into the Asara, toward the Hechal. not clear what the Gemara is going to explain. Now, why do they tie this red wool piece? Some people say this is the same red wool piece that's going to turn white miraculously. Some people say no, this is a different one. This purpose is just to designate that this one's going there and that one's going there. It's a designating red sign to not confuse it from other goats also that are in the temple, so that we know once we did the goral, we don't want to have to do it again. So some people say it's the same, some people say it's a different one. So now that we've designated the goats, we now go back to the bull. If you remember, he did one confession on the bull. We haven't yet slaughtered it. Before we slaughter it, we're going to do another confession. So now the Kohen again does smicha on the animal and does confession. Same kind of wording with one important difference. Or some people say it should be aviti chatati pashati, like the last one. Right, I think that was the order. Aviti pashati chatati, right? I did it on purpose. I did it as a rebellion, and then chatati, accidental. Lifanet, right, that was the Mishnah. Remember, we saw there was a different opinion later in the Gemara. Lifanecha ani ubeiti ubnei Aharon am kedoshecha. Now he's doing a confession for all of the Kohanim. Ana Hashem, please God, kaperna lavonot v'lapshaim v'lachata'im shaviti v'shpashati v'shachatati lefanecha. Please pardon all my sins. Ani uveiti ubnei Aharon am kedoshecha. Me and my house. Notice he does it again on himself and his family and on all the Kohanim. Kakatu b'Torah Moshe avdecha, like it says in the Torah, ki b'yom hazeh yechaper alechem l'terer etchem mikol chatatechem lefnei Hashem titharu. V'hem onim acharav. When he gets to Shem Hashem in the pasuk, he says, Baruch Shem kevo machuto li'olam va'ed. So the first question of the Gemara is going to be, what's this thing about the lanishchat? What is it talking about? Ibayelu. Lanishchat akshirakai or ha'amadakai? Is it the tying or is it standing him up? Do we stand him up facing where he's going to be slaughtered? Or do we, right, meaning then one seir, one goat's looking outward toward the east and one is looking inward toward the west? Or do we say that it's talking about tying? One ties on his head and the other ties around the neck. And that's the way we distinguish. Tashma, let's learn from here. Detani Rav Yosef, he brought a braita. Kashar lashon shel zeorit berosh seir ha'mishtalech ve'mido keneged beit shilucho. That's so far the same thing. We tie this red thread, this red strip of wool around his head and stand him up in the direction he's going to be sent out. V'lanishchat keneged beit shchitato. So far it's exact same words, so it doesn't help us yet. But now it explains why. Shelo yitarev zeh bazeh, so they won't be confused with each other. V'lo yitarev ba'achirim, and they won't be confused with others. Now, if you assume the Beit HaShchita is talking about tying a red piece of wool around its neck, then that will distinguish it from other goats. But if you say it means we just face him the other way, that will distinguish him from the first goat because they're facing different directions. And also one has a red cloth on it and the other one doesn't, but it won't distinguish it from other animals. So that's what they're going to say here, from other goats. So it makes much more sense to say they tied it around his neck, because then it will distinguish him from the other seirim, all the other goats. Because remember, there's all sorts of animals floating around it or roaming around. If you're going to say it's standing him up, it's true, you won't confuse him with the other goat because one has the red cloth around it and the other one doesn't. But it could be confused with other goats. And therefore, so the Gemara concludes it must be that it's tying and not that we stand him up facing the inside to the west. I'm going to just raise one big issue here, which is both in Atakonanta, which is the Sephardi version of the Avodat Yom Kippurim that we say in our davening, that I made reference to already, that we say on Yom Kippur, and the Ashkenazi version, Amitz Koach. The Rosh already asks based on Atakonanta and says, but that's not what it says in Atakonanta. So I'm going to read you from Atakonanta. Lashon shel zeorit, mishkal shnei slaim, we'll get to that soon. Bein karnav yukshor, we tie it between his horns. V'yamideu b'shar hamizrachi, okay, we put him next to the shar, the eastern gate. Keneged beit shilucho, right, opposite to where he's going to go. Ach b'se'ir shel shem yikshor lashon shel zehorit keneged beit shchitato uvala. Wait, oh, sorry, 1 minute. Ach b'se'ir. No, here it says it actually. Oh, sorry, I missed something. By the way, it's a parosh shenit. Keneged beit shchitato b'tzavaro. No, actually, in Atakonanta, thought I looked at this and it seemed to say otherwise, but no, it says this actually matches the Gemara. So I'm not sure why the Rosh questions that. Okay, sorry. The version I have of Atakonanta here says that he ties a lashon shel zehorit keneged beit shchitato in his neck. So there it does say it. In Amitz Koach, it doesn't say it. So I'm not sure about the Rosh. I saw something that the Rosh questions it. Maybe he had a different version. But in Amitz Koach, it says, Seva zehorit kashar berosh hamishtaleach. He ties it around the one that's going to be sent out. Sigato imen neged beit shiluach. The other one, he stood up facing, I'm sorry, that one he sends neged beit shiluach, sorry. Then he stands up the seir hamishtaleach, neged beit shiluach, and that's where it ends. It doesn't say anything about the other one, which seems to indicate that the lashon zehorit was only tied around the seir hamishtaleach and not around the other one. So some explain that it seems from a different Gemara that maybe we don't hold this way, even though this Gemara seemed to conclude that. Okay, but it's a good question. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, shtei lashonot shamati, echad shel para ve'echad shel seir hamishtaleach. I heard two things about two different red strips of wool that I learned about. One is about the para aduma. If you remember, you're supposed to take the agudat ezov, tie the, right, you have to take the red. You also put lashon shel zehorit tied around it. So one about the para and one about the seir hamishtaleach. Remember, and then it's dipped into the waters. Actually, no, it's put onto the burning of the para. Okay, I should actually read you the verse. Let me just get it for a second. The verse there says, find it. ולקח הכהן עץ ארז באזוב ושני תולעת והשליך אל תוך שרפת הפרה. He takes this hyssop branch and the cedar, a cedar branch and a hyssop branch, and the shni tolat, which is a red piece of wool, and he throws it into the burning of the para. Okay, so now we're going to see what happens. He says, I learned that there's two types, one for there and one for the seir hamishtaleach. Echad tzricha shiur ve'echad einat tzricha shiur. One has to be a certain requisite amount, and the other one doesn't. V'lo yadana heminayu. I don't know which is which. Amar Rav Yosef nechse'ana. Rav Yosef says, let's look like this. Shel seir hamishtaleach t'baya chaluka baya shiur. The seir hamishtaleach needs to be split in two, so it needs a shiur because you need, right, part to go on the seir hamishtaleach, right, and part is 1 second. Right, at the end, they tie part of it to a rock and part of it, they split it in two and part of it stays on the seir when they throw it off the cliff. So now we say, so therefore it must be, that one must need the shiur. But the para doesn't need that. So the para doesn't need a certain requisite amount. Rami Barhami says, what do you mean? The para needs weight because if you put it on the fire and the fire is going up, if it doesn't have any weight, it's going to be high up before it's going to burn immediately before it even gets onto the pile of the para. So Amarle Rava Kovet Tanai says, don't worry about that question. It's a machloket tanaim whether it needs weight or not for the para. We'll get to that machloket in a minute or two. So now they say the para lo ba'e chaluka. Wait a minute. The para doesn't need to be split in two either. Wait a minute. Abaye says, Ketzad oseh korcham b'shayarei lashon. It says you're supposed to tie, the part that you're supposed to tie, we don't really want you covering up the branch. So you're supposed to tie it with the shreds, with the edges of like what's left of it, like the thinner part of it. So they say, it sounds like, what's shayarei lashon, what's left over? It sounds like the leftovers means you must have cut it in two. So they say, no, ema bizanav lashon. No, it means the edges of it, not what's left, but what's on the edges, which is thinner, and that way it won't totally cover the branches because we want to be able to see the branch and not have it covered by this red strip of wool. Amar Rabbi Chanin, Amar Rav. Eitz erez ushni tolat shekelatan shalhevet kshira. So now he says, if you have the eitz erez and the shni tolat, that the fire started singeing it, it's okay. Meitive, but they say, wait a minute, it says in a braita, nitavheva lashon mevi lashon achera mekadesh. If the piece of wool got singed before it even got in there, you have to bring a new one. So amabai lo kashya kam bekolacha kam benichtefet. It depends if the fire is high and tall and it gets singed, then it never made it on top of the pot. But if the fire is low, even if it gets singed, it's close enough to the para that it's good enough. Rava Omer kovet tanayi titanya. Here's the braita. Lama korchan kadeshi kulam ba'aguda achat. Why do you have to put them together in one bundle? Because you want them to be bundled together. Okay, and they understand v'lakach. You have to take all these things. They assume it means together, and maybe because it has to be. If you take a little twig of this, a twig of that, and a little strip of wool, nothing looks significant unless you put them together, and then they look like something significant. Divrei Rebbe. The reason you have to bind them is so that they have weight and they fall to the bottom. If you just leave this piece of wool, it'll float, right? And the twig by itself. But if all of it together, it will have weight. So there you see that whether it needs weight or not is this machlok between two Tanaim. The Mitzorah also needs the same red tolat shani. They each have a different weight associated with it, going from highest to lowest. But I don't know which is which, and you'll have to wait till tomorrow. We'll start with Ravin, and he explains which one needs which amount. I already kind of gave it away because I read you that line from Atakonanta, which said how much weight it needs, but maybe you didn't pay enough attention. We will see that tomorrow. So Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov to everyone.